They say the forest doesn't want you dead. It just doesn't care whether you live. And that is the most terrifying thing Steve Calloway ever learned. Not in a classroom, not in a book, not sitting safe and warm in front of a television watching someone else's nightmare unfold on a screen while he sipped hot coffee and thought, glad that's not me. No. Steve learned it on a Tuesday morning in late October, standing in the middle of the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia. When the trail behind him disappeared, the sky above him closed like a wound, and the woman he loved more than anything in this world, his wife, Laura, grabbed his hand so hard her nails left half-moon crescents in his palm, and said 6 words that turned his blood to ice water. Steve, I don't know where we are. Before we go any further, before we walk a single step deeper into what happened to Steve and Laura Calloway over the next 72 hours, 3 days that would strip them down to something raw and animal and desperate and terrifyingly human, I need you to understand something. Steve was not an idiot. He was not reckless. He was not unprepared. He was not the kind of man who wandered into the wilderness on a whim. He was 34 years old. He worked as a structural engineer. He read maps. He understood systems. He was methodical, careful. The kind of man who triple-checked the locks before bed and kept a first aid kit in the glove compartment of his truck. And Laura, God, Laura was sharper than Steve on his best day, and she knew it and loved him anyway. She was a high school biology teacher who could identify a plant by its leaf shape from 20 feet away, and who had spent 2 summers volunteering for a wildlife conservation program in the Appalachians. She knew how to read a compass. She knew which berries to avoid. She knew the difference between edible mushrooms and the ones that would shut your liver down in 48 hours. They were prepared. They had a trail map. They had 2 compasses, one each. They had 2 water filtration straws, a full pack of emergency rations, a fire starter kit, thermal emergency blankets, a fully charged emergency satellite communicator, and enough layers of clothing to survive temperatures well below freezing. They had done everything right. And it still nearly killed them. Because the forest doesn't care how prepared you are. The forest has been here for 10,000 years. It watched the Cherokee walk these ridges. It watched the first settlers cut their trails. It watched 100 years of hikers, hunters, and campers come and go, and it outlasted every single one of them, and it is perfectly patient, and it will outlast you too, and it does not owe you anything, not a trail marker, not a clear sky, not dry wood, not safe footing, not survival. The forest owes you nothing. Steve learned that on a Tuesday. Day 1, hour 1. It started the way all disasters start, with something small, something almost laughably small. A wrong turn. Not even a dramatic wrong turn. Not a cliff edge or a rushing river or a sudden drop into darkness. Just a fork in the trail unmarked, because the last storm had knocked the wooden post clean out of the ground, and it was lying in the leaves about 6 feet off the path, half-rotted and covered in moss, invisible, and Steve went left when he should have gone right. That was it. That was the whole thing. 1 step to the left instead of 1 step to the right, and the next hour and a half of hiking took them deeper into a section of forest that wasn't on their trail map, because their trail map only covered the maintained hiking paths, and they were no longer on a maintained hiking path. They were on what Steve would later describe as a deer trail, a narrow threading of beaten-down vegetation that wound through the trees with all the logic and direction of a fever dream. And by the time he stopped and checked his compass and realized that the bearing they'd been walking didn't match the bearing they should have been walking, they had covered roughly 4 miles in the wrong direction. 4 miles. He stood there, compass in his hand, trees in every direction. The sky above barely visible through the canopy, gray, low, heavy with clouds that had been threatening rain since morning and hadn't delivered yet but were clearly just getting started. "Okay," he said. Laura looked at him. "Okay, what?" "We went the wrong way." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant she was running numbers, processing. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her own compass and checked it against his. Same reading. She looked at the trees. She looked at the sky. She looked down at the ground, at the deer trail that had led them here, which even now, traced backward with the eye, seemed to dissolve into the undergrowth within 20 feet. How far? 4 miles, maybe a little more. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Okay, so we backtrack. Yeah. 4 miles back to the fork, then right instead of left, then we're back on track. Should be about 8 miles total from the trailhead by then. 2.5 hours if we move. We have 5 hours of daylight. Plenty of time. She nodded, he nodded, they turned around. And that was when the rain started. Not a gentle rain. Not a soft autumn misting that you can walk through without getting too wet. This was a full Georgia October downpour. The kind that comes down in sheets, that turns leaf litter into slick mud within minutes, that reduces visibility through the trees to maybe 30 or 40 feet, that fills your ears with a constant roar so that you have to lean close to another person and raise your voice to be heard. Within 10 minutes they were soaked. Not through their outer layers they had good rain gear, but through their spirit, through that invisible thing that keeps you calm and organized and thinking clearly. Because rain changes a forest. It changes the sounds. It changes the smells. It changes the light. It changes the ground beneath your feet. The deer trail that they'd been following, already thin and unclear, was now a shallow rivulet of water, running brown with disturbed soil, and the surrounding ground was absorbing water and softening, and the leaves were becoming treacherous with slickness, and Steve had to slow their pace significantly just to keep his footing. They walked. They walked, and the rain came down and the forest closed around them. And after about 40 minutes, Steve stopped and looked at his compass and felt the first real finger of cold fear trace itself down the back of his neck. We should have hit the fork by now. Laura stopped beside him. What? We've been walking 40 minutes. We should have reached it. She checked her watch, then her compass. Are we walking the right direction? I've been watching the compass. We're walking the right direction. Then why? I don't know. They stood there in the rain and looked at each other and didn't say the thing they were both thinking, because saying it would make it more real, and they weren't ready for it to be real yet. They were lost. Not maybe lost. Not a little turned around lost. Lost in the way that means the trail you walked in on no longer exists under your feet, and the direction you came from is no longer where you think it is, and the forest around you looks exactly the same in every direction, trees, trees, more trees, all of them identical under the gray rain light, none of them offering any kind of landmark or reference point, and your map shows trails, and you are not on a trail. Lost. Okay, Steve said, and his voice was very careful, very controlled, because Laura was watching his face and she was reading him the way she always read him, with total accuracy. And he knew that if he let any of the fear show, it would compound on itself, and they couldn't afford that right now. We stop. We don't keep moving yet. That's the first rule. When you're lost, you stop moving so you don't get more lost. She was already nodding. Stop, stop, think, observe, plan. Right. Okay, so we stop. They stopped. They stood under the partial shelter of a massive white oak, its branches thick enough that the rain came through filtered and slower, and they stood close together and they thought and they observed and they tried to plan. Steve pulled out the satellite communicator. He turned it on. He watched it search for a signal. And search. And search. And search. The tree canopy, the storm clouds, whatever combination of factors conspired against them in that moment, the communicator could not find a satellite. The little screen blinked its searching icon over and over, and the device stayed silent and useless in his hand. He looked at Laura. She was looking at the device. Try moving, she said. Find a gap in the canopy. He tried. He moved in a slow circle, holding the device up, watching the screen. The trees were dense here. The clouds were thick. He walked 20 feet in each direction from the oak, and the device searched and searched and searched. Nothing. He came back to her. "It'll work when the storm passes," he said. "Yes," she said. "When the clouds clear and we can find a gap." "Yes." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The rain intensified. This is where I have to pause and tell you something about survival psychology, because it's important, because it's the thing that separates the people who come out of situations like this alive from the people who don't. And it has nothing to do with physical strength or wilderness training or how many survival shows you've watched. It's about the story you tell yourself in the first hour. Steve told himself, "We are prepared, we have supplies, we have shelter materials, we have fire-starting equipment, we are not injured, we have not been gone long enough for anyone to be alarmed yet. We have until tomorrow morning before anyone comes looking. The storm will pass. The communicator will work. We will be fine." That was a good story. That was the right story. That was the story of a man who intended to survive. But underneath that story, underneath the calm, methodical voice in his head that was reciting facts and plans and logical progressions, was another voice, a quieter voice, a voice that sounded like the rain coming through the leaves. And that voice said, "You don't know where you are. You don't know which way is out. It is getting darker. It is getting colder. And you are 4 miles at minimum from anything that resembles a trail." He pushed that voice down. But it didn't go away. It never went away. Not once over the next 72 hours. It just got quieter or louder depending on what was happening, and sometimes in the darkest parts of the nights to come, it got so loud that it drowned out everything else, and he had to physically, bodily hold himself together to keep it from swallowing him whole. But that's later. Right now, in hour one, Steve Calloway made a decision. "We're not going to try to move until the rain lets up," he said. "We build a temporary shelter here, we stay dry as possible, we wait out the worst of it. When visibility improves and I can get the communicator working, we reassess." Laura looked at him. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead where it had escaped her rain hood. Her eyes, those brown eyes he had been looking into for 11 years, since their first date at a terrible sushi restaurant where they'd both gotten mild food poisoning and laughed about it at the hospital, were calm. Afraid, but calm. Because that's who Laura was. She felt the fear and she didn't let it drive. "Okay," she said, "tell me what you need." They built a lean-to. Steve had watched enough survival content and read enough outdoor manuals to know the basics. And Laura knew more than the basics because she'd actually practiced it during her volunteer summers. And together they found a fallen log, a big one, a beech tree that had come down some time ago and was solid enough to lean against, and they began gathering materials. Dead branches, lots of them. The bigger ones first, dragged and propped against the log at an angle, creating the skeleton of a slanted roof. Then smaller branches laid across the larger ones. Then leaf litter, handfuls and armfuls of it, wet on the surface but drier underneath where it had been sheltered by the living canopy. And they layered it over the branch framework, thicker, as thick as they could manage, until the structure above them began to actually redirect the rain instead of just letting it fall through. It took 45 minutes. By the end of it, they were exhausted in that specific way that cold and wet create. Not the clean exhaustion of exercise, but a heavy, draining tiredness that settles into your joints and your chest and makes everything feel slightly more difficult than it should be. They crawled into the lean-to together. It was not comfortable. The ground was cold. The log behind them was damp. The leaf litter they'd used as flooring smelled of earth and decay. But the rain was no longer hitting them directly, and that was everything. That was the difference between hypothermia and not hypothermia, and they both knew it. Laura opened her pack and pulled out an emergency thermal blanket, the crinkly silver kind, and wrapped it around both of them. The warmth was almost immediate, comparative warmth. Not heat, but the absence of further cold loss, and right now that was luxury. They pressed together. Steve put his arm around her. She put her head against his shoulder. They didn't talk for a while. Outside, the rain fell. The forest sounds changed in the rain. The birds went silent. The insects that had still been calling in the October afternoon went silent. And what filled the space instead was the constant white noise of water on leaves, water on ground, water on water, and the occasional deeper sound of a larger branch somewhere losing its grip and falling through the canopy with a series of crashes that faded into the distance. Inside their lean-to, pressed together under the silver blanket, Steve and Laura were quiet. And in the quiet, the fear grew legs. "What time does it get dark?" Laura asked. Her voice was steady, but he knew her voice, and underneath the steadiness there was something else. He checked his watch. "About 6:30. "What time is it now?" "Fort 12. 2 hours and 18 minutes of daylight, maybe less under these clouds." "We're going to sleep here tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "Most likely." She was quiet again. "Then are you scared?" He almost laughed, not from amusement, from the absurdity of being asked a question so precisely accurate. "Yes," he said. "Are you?" "Yes." "Good." She looked up at him. "Good. Means we're taking it seriously. Fear's useful. Fear's information. Fear means pay attention." She considered this. "My students hate it when I say something like that." "What?" "When I take a bad thing and explain why it's actually useful. They find it annoying." "Annoying but correct." "Usually, yeah." A pause. "I love you." He pulled her closer. "I love you too." The rain kept falling. "Shift here, something changes. The forest does something." It was at approximately 5:45 p.m., in the last gray light before full darkness, that they heard the first sound. It came from somewhere to their left, not far, maybe 60, 70 feet. A sound that Steve's brain, running through its catalog at high speed, could not immediately categorize. Not rain, not a falling branch, not wind. Something organic, deliberate, a kind of crashing through the undergrowth that suggested significant mass moving at speed. They both went rigid at the same moment. Same animal response. Same ancient wiring lighting up in both of them, the part of human neurology that predates rational thought and lives in the brainstem and has one function: danger. The sound moved. It crossed from left to right, maybe 50 feet in front of them, and then kept going and then faded, and the forest was quiet again except for the rain. Steve realized he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly. "Black bear," Laura said, very quietly. He nodded. "They're not, they don't usually." "No," he said, "they're not aggressive normally." Normally doing a lot of work in that sentence. Black bears in the Chattahoochee were a reality. Everyone who hiked there knew it. They were generally shy animals, generally avoidant of humans, generally not a threat unless you surprised them, cornered them, or, and this was the one that was now tapping at the back of Steve's thoughts, if the bear was a mother with cubs, or if it had become habituated to human food sources and associated humans with food, or if... "Steve." "Yeah." "Stop spiraling." He looked at her. Even in the near darkness of the lean-to, he could see her face, and she was watching him with those eyes that read him like a book she'd memorized. "I'm not spiraling. You're doing the thing where your jaw gets tight, and you start calculating worst-case scenarios." He deliberately relaxed his jaw. "The bear is gone." "The bear is gone," she confirmed. "And bears don't come back to things that don't smell like food. We don't have food out. We ate everything hours ago. Our food is sealed in." She stopped. They looked at each other. "Where are the ration bars?" he asked. A pause, 1 second, 2. "In the side pocket of my pack," she said, "outside the lean-to." They looked at the pack, just barely visible in the last light, leaning against the outside of the log structure, with the side pocket, the mesh side pocket, and the faint rectangular outline of the ration bars pressed against the mesh, completely exposed to the air. Bears had one of the most powerful senses of smell in the animal kingdom. A black bear could smell food from over a mile away. "Okay," Steve said. He started to move, to crawl toward the opening of the lean-to. Laura grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Getting the pack. The bear is probably gone, and if it's not making noise, we'll make it go. I'll make noise." "Steve." "Laura," he looked at her. "I have to get the pack inside. If that bear comes back to investigate the food smell and finds our shelter." She let go of his arm. He crawled out into the rain. "Shift here, something changes. The forest does something." It was at approximately 5:45 p.m., in the last gray light before full darkness, that they heard the first sound. It came from somewhere to their left, not far, maybe 60, 70 feet. A sound that Steve's brain, running through its catalog at high speed, could not immediately categorize. Not rain, not a falling branch, not wind. Something organic, deliberate, a kind of crashing through the undergrowth that suggested significant mass moving at speed. They both went rigid at the same moment. Same animal response. Same ancient wiring lighting up in both of them, the part of human neurology that predates rational thought and lives in the brainstem and has one function: danger. The sound moved. It crossed from left to right, maybe 50 feet in front of them, and then kept going and then faded, and the forest was quiet again except for the rain. Steve realized he was holding his breath. He let it out slowly. "Black bear," Laura said, very quietly. He nodded. They don't usually." "No," he said, "they're not aggressive normally." Normally doing a lot of work in that sentence. Black bears in the Chattahoochee were a reality. Everyone who hiked there knew it. They were generally shy animals, generally avoidant of humans, generally not a threat unless you surprised them, cornered them, or, and this was the one that was now tapping at the back of Steve's thoughts, if the bear was a mother with cubs, or if it had become habituated to human food sources and associated humans with food, or if Steve. Yeah. Stop spiraling. He looked at her. Even in the near darkness of the lean-to, he could see her face, and she was watching him with those eyes that read him like a book she'd memorized. "I'm not spiraling. You're doing the thing where your jaw gets tight, and you start calculating worst-case scenarios." He deliberately relaxed his jaw. "The bear is gone." "The bear is gone," she confirmed. "And bears don't come back to things that don't smell like food. We don't have food out. We ate everything hours ago. Our food is sealed in." She stopped. They looked at each other. "Where are the ration bars?" he asked. A pause, 1 second, 2. "In the side pocket of my pack," she said, "outside the lean-to." They looked at the pack, just barely visible in the last light, leaning against the outside of the log structure, with the side pocket, the mesh side pocket, and the faint rectangular outline of the ration bars pressed against the mesh, completely exposed to the air. Bears had one of the most powerful senses of smell in the animal kingdom. A black bear could smell food from over a mile away. "Okay," Steve said. He started to move, to crawl toward the opening of the lean-to. Laura grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Getting the pack. The bear is probably gone, and if it's not making noise, we'll make it go. I'll make noise." "Steve." "Laura," he looked at her. "I have to get the pack inside. If that bear comes back to investigate the food smell and finds our shelter." She let go of his arm. He crawled out into the rain. It was dark. Not full dark, not yet, but close enough that the world beyond the first ring of trees was simply blackness, and the rain was still falling, and the ground was cold under his hands and knees, and every sound seemed amplified by the dark and the rain into something enormous. He reached the pack in 4 seconds. He grabbed it. He turned to go back. And from somewhere in the darkness, closer than before, much closer, from the space between 2 trees maybe 30 feet to his right, he heard it. Breathing. Not the sound of rain on leaves, not a branch. Breathing. The wet, slightly snuffling respiratory sound of a large animal standing still. Watching. Steve went very still. His heart was doing something he had never felt his heart do before. Not a pounding, not a racing, but a lurching, a kind of panicked arrhythmia that he felt in his throat and his wrists and behind his eyes. "Hey," he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "Hey, bear, I see you, good bear." Silence. The breathing continued. "I'm leaving, okay? I'm not threatening you. I'm taking my food and I'm going back in my shelter and you go wherever you want to go. We're good. We're totally good here." He took 1 slow step backward. Another. He kept his eyes on the space between the 2 trees, though in the dark he couldn't actually see anything, just the suggestion of movement, the slight deepening of one area of shadow that might have been an animal, and might have been the rain affecting his vision, and might have been his own terror manufacturing something that wasn't there. 3rd step back. 4th. His heel touched the log of the lean-to. He reached down without breaking his gaze from the dark, found the opening of the shelter, and lowered himself back inside. Laura's hand found him immediately, fingers wrapping around his forearm with ferocious strength. "Are you okay? What happened? I heard you talking." "Bear still there, close." He pulled the pack inside. "Don't talk, don't move, give it a minute." They held completely still. The forest was dark and wet, and noisy with rain, and completely terrifying. After 2 minutes, 2 minutes that felt like years, they heard the sound of movement again. Heavy, crashing through wet vegetation, moving away, further and further until silence swallowed it. Laura exhaled. Steve put his head back against the log and closed his eyes and pressed Laura's hand against his chest so she could feel his heartbeat, which was still doing something abnormal. And after a minute, her thumb began to move in slow circles against his sternum, and gradually, his heart remembered how to beat normally. "Food goes in the pack," he said. "Pack stays closed. Pack comes inside with us." "Yeah," she said. "And we hang it." "On what?" He looked at the lean-to above them, the branches. "I'll figure it out." He did figure it out. It took another 20 minutes and cost him a scraped hand and the loss of 1 branch that formed part of the roof structure, which Laura shored up with 2 others, and by the time the pack was suspended from a branch over their heads, it was fully dark. Full, complete forest dark. Not city dark, not suburban dark, not the dark of a room with a nightlight. Real dark. The kind of dark where you hold your hand in front of your face and cannot see it. The kind of dark that humans have been afraid of since before they were fully human, because the dark is where the things you can't see come from, and the dark is where everything sounds louder and closer and more dangerous than it probably is. And the dark is where your imagination does the work that your eyes can no longer do, and your imagination is not kind. They lay together under the thermal blanket, and the lean-to breathed rain around them, and the dark was absolute. "First night," Laura whispered. "First night," Steve agreed. "We're okay. We're okay." Silence. "Keep talking to me," she said. "About what?" "Anything, I don't care, just talk." So he did. He talked about the trip they'd been planning to Portugal for next spring. He talked about the restaurant they were trying in Atlanta when they got home. He talked about the novel he'd been reading, the plot of which he summarized in extensive detail, partly to give her something to follow, and partly because the act of remembering ordinary things, books and restaurants and travel plans, was an anchor, a rope back to the normal world. Proof that the normal world still existed somewhere beyond these trees. She fell asleep while he was talking. He kept talking anyway, quieter, until his voice gave out, and then he lay in the dark and listened to the rain and did not sleep at all. Night 1, Hour 3. The rain stopped at 11:13 p.m. Steve knew the exact time because he checked his watch, which had a backlight, every 20 minutes throughout the night. Not to plan anything, just to have something to do, some number to look at, some evidence that time was still passing. When the rain stopped, the forest sounds changed again. They filled in, like a body filling with blood after pressure is released. Suddenly, rapidly, the night sounds of the forest rushed in to replace the white noise of rainfall. And Steve was immediately, viscerally aware of how much was alive out there in the dark. Insects that had stayed quiet during the rain began again. Frogs. The distant, intermittent call of something he couldn't identify, a bird maybe or something else. A rustle in the leaf litter to their left that was probably a mouse or a vole or a raccoon, but which, in the dark, in the first night of being lost in a forest with a bear somewhere nearby, sounded for a full 10 seconds like something much larger. Laura slept through most of it. He was grateful. He was also slightly, irrationally envious, not of her ability to sleep exactly, but of the 15 minutes of peace her brain was apparently able to find in this situation. 15 minutes he couldn't access no matter how hard he tried. He tried the satellite communicator at midnight. Clear sky now. He could see stars through a gap in the canopy about 20 feet to the right of the lean-to, and he held the device in that gap with his arm extended and watched it search. 1 minute. 2. 3. And then a different kind of miracle than he would have chosen, but a miracle nonetheless. The screen changed. Connected. His hands shook. He pulled up the emergency messaging function. No voice capability, just text. He typed their location as best as he could describe it, which was not very well. Lost. Chattahoochee NF, last known trail was trail name. Went off trail approx 4 miles, current GPS coordinates. And here he read the coordinates directly off the device screen. Both safe, no injuries, need help finding way out. Will be here in morning. He hit send. The device spent 30 seconds transmitting. The screen said, message sent. He nearly wept. He didn't weep. He held himself back from it with tremendous effort, because weeping felt like a concession to despair, and he couldn't afford despair right now. But his eyes were wet, and his throat was very tight as he crawled back into the shelter and lay down and pressed his face against Laura's hair and breathed her in. She stirred. Steve. Yeah. You okay? Got a message out. Coordinates. Search and rescue will look for us in the morning. A pause, then her hand found his in the dark and held it. Good, she said. Good. Her voice was thick with half-sleep and relief. You're amazing. I'm terrified, he said. I know, she said. That's what makes it amazing. She squeezed his hand. Sleep. I can't. Try. He tried. The forest made its sounds around them. The temperature dropped to something that would later be confirmed as 41 degrees Fahrenheit. They had enough layers. The thermal blanket was doing its job. But 41 degrees is not warm, and the ground is always colder than the air above it, and cold seeps into you in ways that have less to do with temperature and more to do with exposure. With time, with the body's slow understanding that warmth is not guaranteed, that warmth requires effort, that warmth is not a right. At 2 a.m. he heard the bear again. Not close this time. The sound was far enough away that it blended almost with the other sounds of the forest, a deep heavy rustling, moving north of their position, then gone. He didn't wake Laura. He lay and listened and watched the dark. At 4 a.m., something landed on the log above their heads. He heard it land a solid, small weight, and then felt the slight vibration through the log, and then heard nothing more from it. An owl, maybe, or a large squirrel, something that owned the dark in a way he and Laura absolutely did not. At 5:30, the darkness began to lighten by the smallest, most tentative degrees. Not sunrise, not yet, just the first infinitely subtle gray suggestion of the world returning. He felt something he hadn't felt all night. Something not quite hope, but adjacent to it. Dawn. He had survived the first night. Day 2, morning. Laura woke at 6:15, and the first thing she did, even before she was fully conscious, was to reach for him and find him and exhale. "You didn't sleep," she said, not a question. "Not much." She sat up, looked out of the lean-to at the world, which was misty and gray-green and wet and cold, and also, undeniably, genuinely beautiful in the particular way that mornings after rain in forests always are, everything washed clean, the air carrying that cold mineral smell of wet earth, the light coming through the leaves in long diffuse shafts. "Search and rescue," she said. "When do you think they'll—" "I told them we'd be here this morning. I gave them coordinates, but we need to help them find us." She nodded. "Noise, signal fire." "Signal fire, yeah. As soon as we can get wood that's dry enough to burn." She looked at the saturated forest around them, every surface covered in last night's rain. She made a face. "I know," he said. "It's possible to find dry wood after rain. You look for standing dead wood, not fallen, and look for the undersides." "You've been studying." "I've been lying awake all night thinking about every piece of survival information I've ever absorbed in my entire life." She reached over and cupped his face in her hands. His jaw was rough with stubble. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been through something which they both had, and it was only morning of day 2. "We're going to be okay," she said. He put his hands over hers. "Yes," he said, "we are." He meant it. In that moment, in the gray morning light, with Laura's warm hands against his cold face, and the coordinates sent, and the communicator in his pocket, and the daylight returning, he genuinely, fully meant it. But the forest was listening. And the forest had other plans. They were 30 minutes into searching for firewood when Laura fell. Not a dramatic fall. No cliff, no rushing water. Just a slope, a gentle, leaf-covered slope between two trees that looked solid and proved to be anything but. The rain-soaked leaves over a layer of clay soil that had become essentially a low-angle slip surface, and her foot went out from under her, and she went down, and the slope was only about 12 feet, but at the bottom of the slope there was a rock. The sound she made when she hit it was the worst sound Steve had ever heard in his life. Not the impact, not the involuntary gasp, the sound that came after that high, compressed, almost surprised cry, the sound of someone experiencing pain they weren't prepared for. He was down the slope in seconds, skidding on the same surface that had taken her down, catching himself on a tree halfway, reaching her in a controlled fall rather than a clean descent. She was sitting up, both hands clutched around her left ankle, face white. "I'm okay," she said immediately. "I'm okay, I just—" "Don't move it." "Steve." "Don't move it." He was down beside her, hands on the ankle, gentle, careful. "Tell me what you feel." A sharp intake of breath as his fingers found the site of the injury. There, that spot, right there. He pressed lightly. She made a sound. "Okay." He sat back. He looked at her face. He looked at the ankle. He looked at the forest around them. He looked at the slope she'd just come down and the rock she'd hit, and the absolutely impossible terrain between where they were and where they needed to be. He did not let any of what he was feeling show on his face. "Can you feel your toes?" "Yes." "Wiggle them." She did. She winced, but she did. "Good, no tingling, no numbness." "No, it hurts." I know it does." He looked at the ankle more carefully. The boot was still on, which was both a problem and a blessing. A problem because it hid the injury, a blessing because it was providing some compression and support. "We're going to leave the boot on for now. Don't take it off." "I know. Because if it swells—" "I know, Steve. I teach human biology." He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that moment, despite everything, despite the fear and the cold and the loss and the injury, she smiled. A small, rueful, exhausted smile. The smile of someone who loves another person enough to joke with them in the worst possible moment. He almost broke apart. He held it together. "We need to get you somewhere flat," he said. "Can you bear weight on it at all?" She tried. She put her hand on his shoulder and pushed herself upright and took one careful step and made a sound that told him the answer before she said it. "Not really, not without." Okay, you're not walking on it." He looked around. Plan, think. I'm going to make you a crutch." "Steve." "One good stick, right height, padded at the top. You can lean on it. We don't need to go far, just back to our shelter where it's flat and you can sit and elevate it. We need to find a signal. First things first. The fire. First things first, Laura." She went quiet. He stood up. He looked at the trees. He found what he needed in about 2 minutes, a solid, straight birch limb, recently fallen, about the right height, the bark still intact and tight, which meant the wood inside was probably not rotten. He tested it against his weight. It held. He pulled his jacket off and wrapped the sleeve around the top end, securing it with a shoelace from his boot, creating a padded grip. He brought it to her. She took it, she tried it. It worked. Not perfectly. She was still limited to a slow, careful, 3-point movement, but she could move. They made it back to the shelter in 20 minutes, a distance that normally would have taken 2. He elevated her ankle on a folded section of their gear bag. He sat back and looked at it and at her and at the morning and thought, okay, recalculate. What do we have? What do we need? What can we do? Search and rescue was coming. He'd sent the coordinates. They just needed to be findable when the rescuers arrived. They needed a signal, smoke, ideally, sound, movement toward open ground. But Laura couldn't walk. And the forest was still wet. And the morning was slipping away. Day 2, midday. He found dry wood. It took him an hour of searching, moving wider and wider from their shelter in careful expanding circles, so he could always find his way back, checking every standing dead tree he came across, testing the bark, probing with a stick, looking for the specific qualities that meant burnable. He found an old snag, a dead and standing pine that had dried from the inside out. The bark was coming away in places, and where it had come away the wood underneath was pale and dry and fibrous. He broke off pieces with his hands, tested them by bending. Dry wood snaps, wet wood bends. These snapped. He loaded his arms with as much as he could carry. He brought it back. He built the fire with methodical care, the way he'd read about and practiced in his backyard 3 years ago for a camping trip and never actually needed to use properly. Tinder first, the driest, finest material he could find, which ended up being the fabric from the inside of his emergency pack, a small cotton square he unraveled. Then kindling, the smallest pieces of his dry pine, arranged in a small pyramid. Then the larger pieces around and above. He used the fire starter. On the 4th strike, the tinder caught. He breathed on it, very gently, very carefully, the way you breathe on the most fragile, precious thing in the world. The flame grew. The kindling caught. The fire breathed. He almost wept again. He was doing a lot of almost weeping that he was not following through on, which was probably healthy but was also exhausting. Laura, watching from the shelter, said, "Oh, thank God." "Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah. You did that. We did that." He built it carefully, fed it slowly. When it was established enough, he added green branches, wet, living branches, which produced exactly what he wanted: thick white smoke that rose above the treetops in a column visible for miles. Signal fire active. He stood back and looked at it and felt the first genuine wave of something that might be called confidence, not certainty, but the cousin of certainty, the sense that things were moving in the right direction. Then his stomach dropped, because he'd been so focused on the fire, so completely concentrated on that one task, that he'd stopped paying attention to everything else. And what he had stopped paying attention to was the sky, which had been clear this morning, which was no longer clear. From the west over the ridgeline, a wall of clouds was moving in with a speed that spoke of something serious, not the gentle overcast of yesterday, something darker, lower, moving faster. He checked the weather function on his satellite communicator. No signal again, they were under the tree canopy. He moved to the gap where he'd gotten signal last night and held the device up and waited. 30 seconds, a minute. Connected. He checked the weather. A second storm system, moving through faster than predicted. Expected arrival 2 to 4 hours. Duration 6 to 8 hours. Precipitation heavy. Temperatures dropping significantly overnight. Overnight low, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Below freezing. He stood in the gap in the trees and looked at that number and felt it settle over him like a physical weight. 28 degrees. With a wet forest and limited shelter, and an injured wife and firewood that wouldn't survive another heavy rain. 28 degrees would not kill them if they were dry and insulated and sheltered properly. 28 degrees could kill them if they weren't. Hypothermia didn't need to reach extreme temperatures. Hypothermia just needed your core temperature to drop enough. And wet plus cold plus wind was the formula. And tonight the formula was going to be available in abundance. He messaged search and rescue again. Second storm incoming. Still at same coordinates. Wife has ankle injury, limited mobility. Please advise ETA. He waited. 20 minutes passed before the response came. Teams delayed by incoming weather system. Air support grounded. Ground teams mobilizing but facing difficult terrain and visibility. We have your coordinates. Stay in place. Maintain signal if possible. Keep warm. We will reach you. Stay in place. He read that message 3 times. Stay in place. Not will be there in 2 hours. Not rescue team en route, ETA 90 minutes. Stay in place. Which meant we don't know when we're coming. He walked back to the fire, which was still burning, still sending its column of smoke up through the trees, and he stood next to it and felt its warmth on his face and thought about what 28 degrees meant, and about how much dry wood he had left, and about the shelter which was good but not good enough for a below-freezing night without a fire, and about Laura's ankle which would swell more in the cold, and about how many hours of daylight they had left, and about what they needed to do in those hours. And he thought, okay, so we do another night, we can do another night, we have done one night, we can do one more. And then he thought, but can Laura? And that thought, the specific, targeted fear not for himself but for her, was worse than all the other fears combined. He went back to the shelter and knelt beside her and did something he had been carefully not doing since the fall. He told her the truth. Not all of it. Not the full, unmediated truth, which was, I am scared for you in a way I have never been scared for anything, and I don't know if I can keep you safe tonight, and the rescue team doesn't know when they're coming, and I am barely holding it together. He told her the edited truth, which was, another storm is coming, cold one, rescue is delayed, we need to prepare for another night. She listened without interrupting. Her ankle was elevated. Her face was composed. She was doing the same thing he was doing, performing calm for the benefit of the other person, both of them performing calm at each other while the fear ran underneath like a river. How cold? She asked. 28 overnight. A pause. That's cold. We can manage it. We need more insulation in the shelter, and we need to keep the fire going through the night, and we need. Steve. He stopped. She was looking at him the way she sometimes looked at him when he was going too fast, thinking too loud, running too far ahead. The way that meant, stop, be here, be present. Sit down, she said. He sat. You haven't eaten since yesterday. He blinked. He genuinely hadn't thought about food since when? Breakfast yesterday before the hike. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're running on adrenaline and willpower, and those are finite resources, and I need you to eat something. She reached into the pack and found 2 of the ration bars. She held one out to him. He took it. They ate in silence, and the fire crackled, and the smoke rose, and somewhere above the tree line the clouds from the west were arriving. Thank you, he said. You would have keeled over in an hour. Probably. You're doing great, she said quietly. I mean that, you've been doing everything right. We've been doing everything right. Steve, she waited until he looked at her. I need you to hear me say this. You've been doing great, not us. You built this shelter, you made the fire, you got the message out. You found us firewood. I've been sitting here with my ankle in the air. I know that's not nothing. I know I'm conserving energy and staying warm and being calm, but you've been, she stopped. Her voice was not entirely steady. You've been incredible, and I know you're scared. I can see it. And I need you to know that I see it and I'm not scared of it. I'm scared too. We're scared together, okay? He sat with her words. Outside, the wind picked up. Okay, he said. The second storm arrived at 3:47 in the afternoon. It arrived with something the first storm hadn't had, wind. Not a gentle forest wind that stirs the leaves and cools the air pleasantly. A driving, sustained wind from the northwest that cut through the tree canopy and found every gap in their lean-to with precision. That sent the fire, which Steve had built higher and hotter in anticipation, guttering and sometimes flat. That drove the rain in nearly horizontal sheets, so that even within the lean-to, with the leaf layering he'd spent 2 hours reinforcing, cold water found them. He'd spent those 2 hours between the end of the first storm and the arrival of the second doing 3 things: collecting and covering as much dry firewood as he could, reinforcing the lean-to, and making Laura as comfortable and as insulated as he could manage. He'd wrapped her in both thermal blankets. He'd made a ground layer of the driest leaves he could find. He'd elevated her ankle on a section of his now disassembled rain jacket stuffed with leaves. She was as ready as he could make her. He was less ready. He'd given her both thermal blankets because his body was still functioning, still moving, still generating heat through activity. He was in his layers, good layers, wicking base, insulating mid, wind-resistant outer. But without the thermal blankets, he was relying entirely on his own heat generation to stay warm. And heat generation requires calories, and they were on half rations now, splitting what they had to make it last. And the calorie deficit was already making itself known as a kind of blunted thinking, a slight haziness at the edges of his cognition. He sat at the entrance to the lean-to, close enough to the fire that he could tend it without leaving shelter, and he tended the fire. All night. He tended the fire. This is the part of Steve's story that I find almost impossible to fully convey in words, because what I'm describing is fundamentally an experience of the body and not the mind, and experiences of the body resist language. The cold, the sustained, patient, invasive cold of a Georgia night dropping toward freezing, with wind and rain stripping the air of heat, with the fire doing its best, but the fire was one source of warmth in an enormity of cold, and the cold was patient in a way the fire was not. The fire needed constant feeding, constant tending, constant attention. The cold just was. The cold needed nothing. The cold would outlast the fire as easily as it would outlast Steve if Steve let it. He didn't let it. Every 20 to 30 minutes throughout that night he crawled out into the rain and gathered more wood from the covered pile he'd made and came back and fed the fire. He checked on Laura asleep, breathing steadily, warm enough, ankle elevated every hour. He watched the fire. He watched the dark. He listened to the forest and the storm. Somewhere around midnight, the temperature hit its low. He knew it had hit its low because his body told him, not with a reading but with a feeling. A point past which the cold was not getting worse but simply staying at its worst. A kind of settling. A new baseline. He was shivering. He had been shivering for hours. He knew that shivering was his body doing its job, generating heat through muscle activity. And he knew that the point at which shivering stopped was the point to be afraid of, because that was when the body stopped fighting and started shutting down. So the shivering was good. The shivering was his body saying not yet, not today. He kept the fire going. At 2 a.m. Laura woke. She woke the way she sometimes woke from nightmares. Suddenly, completely, sitting up with a sharp intake of breath, reaching for him. He was right there. "Hey," he said. "Hey, I'm here." She grabbed his arm. She was oriented within seconds. He could see her remember, could see her face cycle through the sequence of awakening and realizing where she was and why she was here and what was happening. And then she looked at him. "You're still up. Keeping the fire. You need to sleep. One of us needs to keep the fire. Steve, if you don't sleep." "I'm okay." "You're not." "Laura," he said it gently. "I'm okay, go back to sleep. I'll sleep in the morning when it's lighter, when it's warmer." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he knew she was seeing things on his face that he wasn't aware of putting there. "Talk to me," she said. "You should sleep. Talk to me, tell me something. Tell me about the Portugal trip in detail, every day." So he did. He sat at the entrance to their shelter with the fire between him and the rain, and he talked about Portugal in exhaustive detail, the Algarve coast, and the pastéis de nata, and the yellow trams in Lisbon, and the language which he'd been slowly learning from an app, and which he was terrible at but which Laura found charming. He talked about the hotel they'd looked at in Lagos, the one with the rooftop pool that overlooked the ocean. He talked about the itinerary they'd sketched out on a Sunday afternoon in March, sitting at their kitchen table with laptops and coffee, and a map spread between them. The kitchen table. The coffee. The Sunday afternoon. That world, that warm, ordinary, incandescent world. Laura listened, and somewhere in the middle of his description of a restaurant in Sintra that had reviewed well, she fell back asleep. He kept talking quieter until he ran out of things to say. Then he watched the fire. Then he watched the dark. The rain eased around 4 a.m. The cold did not ease. The cold stayed. The cold had committed. At 5:15, sitting cross-legged in the entrance to the linta with the fire burning in front of him, his back against the log, he fell asleep. For 23 minutes. He woke because the fire was dying. He didn't make a sound. He simply lurched back into consciousness with the particular panic of someone who knows they cannot afford to have been asleep, checked the fire, found it low but not out, and fed it, and the fire took the new wood and breath back to life. He sat back. He looked at the fire. He put his head in his hands. He sat that way for a long time. Day 3, dawn. Dawn of the third day was different from dawn of the second. Day 2's dawn had come with a kind of relief. The night survived, the morning arrived, the sense of progress. Day 3's dawn arrived quietly, without fanfare, filtered through clouds that were finally moving east, and it found Steve diminished. He was cold in a deep way. Not dangerously cold, not hypothermic. He was careful to evaluate himself against the signs, but cold in the bones, cold in the way that feels permanent, like the cold has gotten inside and set up residence and doesn't intend to leave. His hands were stiff. His joints ached. His thinking was slightly slower than usual, slightly more effortful, like a computer running too many programs at once. He had slept 23 minutes in approximately 40 hours. He was on the tail end of the food they'd brought. He looked at Laura. She was awake. She'd been awake for an hour, lying still because she'd wanted to let him rest while the fire was stable and the dawn was coming. She told him this later, that she had lain still and watched him sleep those 23 minutes and had not woken him because she knew what 23 minutes meant to a body that had been going this long. She was looking at him with those eyes. "Hey," she said. "Hey, how are you?" He considered lying. He considered the comfortable, easy, confident lie that would reassure her and take nothing for himself. He looked at her face, those eyes, that face, the face he had been looking at for 11 years and intended to look at for many more, and he decided against the lie. "Rough," he said, "honest answer." She nodded slowly, rough as in. "Tired, cold, thinking slower than I should be, hungry," a pause, scared. "Okay," she said. "All of that is okay. All of that is manageable. None of that is dangerous yet." "No, not yet. What do we need to do today?" He gathered himself, ran through the priorities. Get the signal fire going again. Try the communicator in the open, weather's clearing. And I think, he stopped, looked around at the forest. I think we need to move toward open ground. The coordinates I sent are accurate, but getting a visual on us from the air is going to be hard in this canopy. If I can find a clearing or a ridge somewhere open and get Laura there. "I can walk," she said. He looked at her ankle. "Not well," she amended, "but I can walk. Give me the crutch and tell me where we're going." "You shouldn't put weight on it." "Probably not, but I can put some weight on it for short distances if I'm careful." She met his eyes. "We're not going to get found lying here in this shelter, Steve. We need to find open ground. I'll walk." He wanted to argue. He thought about arguing. He thought about the ankle and the terrain and the wet ground and the risk of her falling again. And he thought about what one more fall might mean. And he thought about the fact that they had now been in this forest for 2 nights, and the rescue team didn't have a visual on them, and the canopy was dense. "Okay," he said, slowly, "and you tell me immediately." "Immediately, yes. If it gets worse." "I will. Promise me." She held his gaze. "I promise." They struck camp at 7:15 a.m. Steve put out the fire carefully, though part of him wanted to leave it burning as a signal. The risk of a spreading fire in the recovering forest wasn't one he was willing to take. He buried it with dirt and wet leaves, checking until the smoke was completely out. He packed everything into the single pack, which he carried. He gave Laura the crutch. And they walked. North by northeast, because the terrain that direction appeared to rise, and rising terrain meant ridges, and ridges meant open sky and potential clearings, and the kind of elevation from which a rescue helicopter might spot 2 very tired, very desperate people who very badly wanted to go home. The forest was different after the second storm. Heavier, more waterlogged. The ground was saturated to a depth that made every step a slight uncertainty. You put your foot down and weren't always sure if the ground was going to hold or give. Steve tested each step as much as he could, but the terrain required movement, and movement required commitment, and sometimes the ground gave when he needed it not to. He fell twice. Minor falls, one to a knee, one to both hands, but they cost time and they cost morale in ways he couldn't quite afford. Laura fell once. Her right foot, compensating for the injured left, found a hidden hole under the leaves, old animal burrow, maybe, or a root channel that had washed clear. And her leg dropped 6 inches, and she went down sideways, and the sound she made. He was there in a second. "I'm okay," she said before he could say anything. "I'm okay. The ankle, it didn't," she checked herself. "It's okay, it didn't take impact." He helped her up. Her face was mud-streaked. Her eyes were bright with the proximity of tears that she was not going to let fall. He cupped her face in his hands the way she'd done for him, the mirror of that gesture, and she pressed her forehead against his, and they stayed that way for 10 seconds, just breathing. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They walked day 3, hour 4. They had been walking for 3 hours when Steve smelled it. Smoke, not their smoke, their fire was long out. This was different smoke. Drier, cleaner. The smoke of a maintained fire or something like it. And beneath it something else, something that took him a moment to identify because it was so ordinary, so completely ordinary, that his exhausted brain almost didn't recognize it. Coffee. He stopped walking. What? Laura said. Do you smell that? She sniffed, her eyes widened. Which direction? She said. He turned slowly. The wind was light but present, coming from the northwest. He turned to face it. That way. They moved toward it. The terrain shifted. The trees thinned slightly. The ground began to show flatter sections between the roots. And then, 60 feet ahead, through a gap in the tree line, something he had not seen since this nightmare began. A trail. An actual, maintained, marked trail. He could see the shape of it from here, the deliberate clearing, the wooden marker post, the compressed earth of regular foot traffic. And standing at the marker post, 2 people in orange vests, one holding a radio, one with a pack that looked like it had medical equipment in it, both of them scanning the forest with the practiced, systematic attention of people who do this for a living. Search and rescue. He didn't make a sound immediately. He stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at those 2 people in orange vests, and something happened in his chest that he would later spend a long time trying to describe and never quite manage to describe adequately. Not relief. Relief was too small a word. Not joy. Joy was too bright a word. Something that combined all the fear and all the cold and all the fire tending and all the dark and all the shivering and all the almost weeping and all the hours of watching his wife sleep and hopping with everything he had that she would be okay, and compressed it all into a single moment and released it, like a pressure valve opening, like a breath you'd been holding for 3 days. He turned to Laura. She had seen them too. Her face. He would never forget her face in that moment. The way it crumpled, not in weakness, but in release, in the way a face crumples when the thing you've been bracing against finally passes and your muscles can stop bracing. The way the tears came, fast and immediate, not from sadness but from the body's sudden permission to feel everything it had been holding. He put his arm around her. Hey, he called. His voice was wrecked, hoarse from 2 nights of talking and 3 days of cold. Hey, over here. Both figures in orange turned immediately. One of them raised the radio. The other started moving toward them. What happened next was both very fast and very slow. Very fast in terms of events. The rescuers reached them in under 2 minutes. The experienced efficiency of people trained for exactly this scenario was humbling to witness. One of them was already assessing Laura's ankle with practiced hands, while the other was talking to Steve, taking his vitals in a calm and professional way that made Steve feel simultaneously incredibly grateful and slightly embarrassed about the depth of his own relief. Very slow in terms of feeling, because he was running on almost nothing, and when the adrenaline that had been holding him upright for 3 days began to release, it released slowly, in stages, and each stage was like setting down a weight he hadn't fully registered carrying. The lead rescuer, a woman named Angela, who had been searching this section of the forest since before dawn and who had located them using a triangulation of the GPS coordinates Steve had sent plus their signal fire smoke, told them that a team of 6 had been in the forest since yesterday afternoon, moving in after the storm, working through the night. 6 people. Looking for them. All night. Steve sat with that. Your message was good, Angela said. The coordinates were accurate. The smoke helped. We had a visual on the smoke column this morning as soon as the clouds moved. That was smart. My wife's idea, Steve said. Laura, who was getting her ankle wrapped by the second rescuer, looked up and caught his eye and gave him a look that said clearly, It was your idea and we both know it, and why are you?" And he gave her a look back that said, "Let me have this one." She rolled her eyes, which on her exhausted, tear-streaked, mud-streaked, 3-day-in-the-forest face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The walk to the trailhead took 40 minutes. Angela coordinated it with quiet professionalism, Steve carrying the pack, Laura supported by the second rescuer on one side and her crutch on the other, moving carefully, steadily through the forest that was already impossibly beginning to look different. Not dangerous, not hostile, just a forest, trees, ground, light through canopy. Just a forest. Remarkable, Steve thought, how quickly the mind recategorizes. At the trailhead there was a truck. There was warmth inside the truck. There were blankets. There were people with radios. There was, on a folding table outside the command post van, a thermos of coffee. They gave him a cup. He wrapped both hands around it. He stood in the weak October sun. The clouds had cleared. The sky was a deep and clean blue, and drank it and felt the warmth spread from his hands to his chest and let himself, finally, completely, feel it. Feel all of it. Everything he hadn't let himself feel over the past 72 hours, because feeling it would have cost him the performance of calm, the steady projected confidence that had been both real and constructed in equal parts. He let it come now, in the warming October morning at the trailhead, with the truck and the blanket and the coffee and the sound of the radio crackling with voices. He cried. Not dramatically, not with sound, just his eyes filled and the tears came, and he stood in the sun and let them, because they were earned and they were appropriate and there was no one to perform for any more. From the truck, Laura watched him. She said nothing. She just watched. And when he got himself back together, which took a minute, maybe two, she held out her hand and he walked to the truck and climbed in beside her and took her hand. "Portugal," she said. He laughed, unexpected, real, slightly broken. "Yeah. Soon as my ankle heals." "The rooftop pool." "The rooftop pool," she confirmed. "We're booking it when we get home." "Deal." She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his head on hers. The truck started. The forest slid away behind them through the rear window, trees, trees, more trees, then the curve of the gravel road, then paved road, then the first houses of the first small town they reached, with its gas stations and its traffic lights and its extraordinary, miraculous, completely taken for granted ordinariness. Steve Calloway's left hand still shows the half-moon marks from Laura's fingernails, the one she pressed into him in that first moment when she said, "I don't know where we are." He noticed them about a week after they got home, when his hand had healed enough from the scrapes and the cold to reveal what was underneath. And when he saw those marks, he sat with them for a long time. They faded. All marks do. But that's the thing about survival. The surviving is the thing you can point to, the thing you can tell people about, the story with a beginning and a middle and an end. What you can't as easily point to is everything the surviving leaves behind. Not the scars, not the marks, but the knowing. Steve knows now in his body, in the particular way that only experience can teach, that warmth is not permanent, that trails can disappear, that the ground can look solid and be anything but, that darkness can last much longer than you think you can bear it, and then bear more. He knows what his wife is made of. He knew before, he always knew, but knowing and knowing are different. And standing in the dark of a Georgia forest at 3 in the morning, freezing, exhausted, listening to her breathe and making decisions about fire and shelter and risk, and all of it because she needs him to, watching her wake from a nightmare and immediately reach for him, and immediately start managing her own fear to protect his knowing that, carrying that. That's a different kind of knowing. That's the knowing you can't get anywhere except the dark. They went to Portugal in March. They got the rooftop pool. The pastéis de nata were everything. Steve's Portuguese was terrible and Laura's was passable, and the restaurant in Sintra was closed on Wednesdays, but they found another one that was better. On the second night, sitting on the rooftop at sunset with wine and the Atlantic going gold and pink below them. Laura put her hand over his on the table. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "That first night, when you wouldn't stop talking about Portugal." He was quiet. "You were doing it for me," she said, "to keep me calm, to give me something to hold on to." She looked at the sunset. "But I think you were doing it for yourself too, to remind yourself what was waiting." He thought about that. About all those hours in the dark, voice dropping to almost nothing, describing rooftop pools and tramcars and restaurant menus, keeping himself attached to the world beyond the trees by talking his way back to it. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." She turned and looked at him. "It worked," she said. He looked at her face that he knew better than his own, at the half-healed smile that still turned slightly to the left when she was feeling something deeply. "Yeah," he said, "it did. The forest doesn't want you dead. It just doesn't care whether you live." And learning that, really learning it, in your body, in the dark, in the cold, in the fear that doesn't fully go away even when the coffee is in your hands, and the truck is warm and the forest is in the rearview mirror. Learning that is, somehow, the most clarifying thing that can happen to a person. Because on the other side of it, you understand, in a way you didn't before, exactly why it matters that you do care whether you live.